And so we come to the last of the Old Testament overview units, the period we call the 400 years of silence. Now, it's called the years of silence not because nothing of significance happened, indeed much happened, but because there was no prophet. Malachi was the last of the prophets. One of the last words he said was, "Obey the law of Moses." And there was no prophet from Malachi to Matthew. And it's in Matthew that we have John the Baptist appearing. And John the Baptist was an indication that the prophetic word was again coming to Israel. That's why there was so much excitement in Judea with John the Baptist. Okay, so this period is basically the gap between Malachi and Matthew. It's about 400 years, for 440 BC down to the birth of Christ, which is 6 BC. And there's a lot that happened that really, when you come to the New Testament, is very influential in the New Testament period. If we just have a big sweep, we find that the Greeks end up conquering Darius and the Persians, and Alexander the Great's empire, in his untimely death, divided into four. The two most prominent peoples were the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. We will look at that. Out of the Seleucid Empire came the king Antiochus Epiphanes. He persecuted the Jews with a desire to completely destroy them. In a response to that, we have the uprising of the Maccabees, and that brings about a period of independence for about 100 years, until the general Pompey from Rome came, attacked Jerusalem, and Judea, Samaria, Galilee became part of the Roman Empire. So, firstly, Alexander the Great, he had some really spectacular victories over the Persians. The Persians had continued to attack the Greek cities and Greek islands, and Alexander recognized that there would be no peace from that until the Persians were defeated. It was actually his father Philip of Macedonia that started this campaign, and Alexander, this young man, took it on when his father died. And so he took his troops across from Europe into Asia, into modern-day Turkey, and he defeated the Persians on the outpost at the river Granicus in 334, and then marched east and met Darius and his troops at a place called Issus in 333 BC. Defeating Darius with a rather spectacular victory, he then moved and took Tyre and Egypt and the cities in the eastern Mediterranean. And then there was a final defeat at Arbela, where the Persian army was destroyed. Here is a map. If you look at the red dots, you will see the three battles that I have mentioned. To the just below the Black Sea, you have the first battle, and then the one there in the middle at Issus, and then finally at Arbela. Alexander the Great is known for the speed with which he took the Persian Empire, and he went as far as India and would have gone further. But his troops wanted to go back, and with great reluctance he stopped his empire building. He died young. We're not sure whether he was poisoned or some other unfortunate thing happened. But because there was no heir, he did have a son who was very young. Because there was no heir, his empire broke up into four. Now Daniel had already prophesied this. He prophesied this particularly in chapter 8 of Daniel. And it broke up into four, but as far as the Jews were concerned, the two generals who would be affecting them was Ptolemy and Seleucus. Ptolemy took Egypt, and Seleucus took Syria and Babylon, and the interaction between these two nations now, these two kingdoms, would end up affecting Israel very much. Here we have the green is the kingdom of Seleucus, and the red there is the Ptolemaic kingdom. Now, Ptolemy actually was a caretaker general for the son of Alexander, but Alexander's son died, and therefore probably killed Ptolemy, simply took that kingdom. To begin with, Judah was part of the Ptolemaic kingdom, but eventually, with the battles between these two kingdoms, Judah became part of the Seleucid kingdom. Now, miraculously, these events are recorded especially in Daniel chapter 11. Eventually, a king arose by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. He was part of the Seleucid dynasty. By this time, Judah was part of the Seleucid kingdom, and he, out of retaliation for what had happened in Egypt, attacked the Jews, and he decided that he would force all of his kingdom to worship one god, and that god was Olympian Zeus. And so this began in 167 BC, and a bit later he attacked Jerusalem and the temple, and he went in and stopped the morning and evening sacrifice to Yahweh, and he set up an altar to Olympian Zeus. And on the 25th of Chislev, 167, that is December the 16th, in our calendar, he offered a swine on the altar he had built in the temple to Olympian Zeus. And here we have the desecration of the temple. He then insisted that all the Jews would give up their law, give up circumcision, give up Sabbath keeping, and worship Olympian Zeus. And some of his soldiers came to a village just to the northwest of Jerusalem, the village of Modi'in, and gathered the men together and was going to force them to offer a sacrifice. But Mattathias, a priest, rose up with a sword and rebelled, killed the soldiers, and then he and his sons, knowing that they were in big trouble, left the village, took to the hills, and as they did that, other Jews gathered, and so there was a rebellion against this edict of Antiochus Epiphanes. The leader of this rebellion became one of his sons, Judas, and he got a nickname, Maccabeus, which means a hammer. And they began with guerrilla warfare, and eventually their army built, and they had some spectacular victories over the Greeks. Antiochus had to leave Judea and take care of business in another part of his empire. But what happened was, with the uprising of the Maccabees, Judas Maccabeus, the Greek armies were defeated, and the temple was rededicated 3 years after it was desecrated. That is the 14th of December 164. And this became known as the celebration of Hanukkah and is still celebrated today. Now, it is Judas Maccabeus and his followers that Daniel addresses in Daniel 11:32, where it's talking about the desecration of the temple, and it says very simply that those that know their God will be strong and take action. And it's this word that Judas Maccabeus actually lived out with him. And from this point onwards, there was a period of independence for the Jewish people. And so the offspring, the descendants of Judas Maccabeus, became known as the Hashmoneans, and they ended up ruling both as high priest and king. This was something that, of course, God never wanted, but there was this independence, and the descendants of the Maccabees were those in control. This is also, as I've mentioned, a time when the Pharisees arose. This was a group of people that were eager to see the Messiah come and felt that if they were zealous in law keeping, that would help them. And so they became experts in the law, not only the written law but the traditions also. Around the known world too, with Jewish communities of people that didn't return to Judea, there grew the synagogue. This was a way that the Jews could practice their religion without a temple and without sacrifice. They would gather together and study Torah and pray and sing hymns. And so with the Hashmoneans we have the line of priest kings. This lasted until Pompey came, and the Roman general Pompey. He attacked Jerusalem in 64 BC, and one of the comments we know from history was he went into the Holy of Holies and was surprised to find it empty. Presumably he expected to find an idol there, as that's normally what would be in any temple's holy place. But of course, that tells us that the Ark of the Covenant had been lost and was no longer there. Anyway, even as Judea and Samaria and Galilee was now part of the Roman Empire, there was a Idumean chief, Antipater, who Idumea was really where the Philistines were. They were now half Jews, these people. He rose up in prominence, and his son Herod became very well liked because he collected the taxes for the Romans, and eventually he had permission to rule on behalf of Rome, Judah, Galilee, Samaria, and this area, which he did. And this, of course, brings us to the beginning of the New Testament period, where we see Herod the Great there at the same time of the birth of Jesus. During this time, the Romans had been building roads that was connecting their empire, that made travel much easier than it had before, but also the language of Alexander the Great and the culture of the Greeks had been adopted throughout the Roman Empire too. And so we have a situation when that part of the world, travel was easier than it had ever been, and also communication. The expectation and desire for the Messiah had continued to grow. And it was with this expectation that we come into the New Testament. People in Judah and Israel had been under the yoke of slavery for so long. They were eager for the Messiah, hoping that the Messiah would come and deliver them from the injustice and the oppression of the Romans. Here is a map of the Roman Empire, you'll see that the significance of Judah and Judea was that they were the extreme eastern part of the empire, and therefore they were like the buffer. This part of the Roman Empire needed to be kept in submission because without that, the Roman Empire was vulnerable to those people to the east, and this was something that was not acceptable. So when the Jews rebelled, that was why Vespasian and eventually Titus in AD 70 came down with such force to bring this part of the world back into the Roman Empire. And so we have had an overview of the Old Testament. There is much, much more that could be said, of course, but what we have now is the setting for the coming of Jesus and the Messiah, the one that came and brought the message, the kingdom of God is at hand, a message that Israel had been waiting for. But of course the Messiah that came was not quite the Messiah they were expecting. He was coming as a king, yes, but as a suffering servant. And that brings us to the glorious message of the gospel, because Jesus was going to come and not just save Israel, but be the suffering servant that would bring salvation to the nations. And through Jesus and the work of Jesus, and then those that came from him, the church, they would become the true children of Abraham, and through them all the nations of the earth would be blessed. And indeed, we have the privilege of being part of that.